I'm standing in the middle of Fort Bragg, home of the airborne and one of the world's premier military training facilities. Fort Bragg's 160,000 acres is also home to a stunning variety of cultural and natural resources. And that's our story today on Exploring North Carolina. Fort Bragging Rights.
Fort Bragg is almost as big as a county, covering 160,000 acres between Fayetteville and Sanford. Since just after World War I, tens of thousands of men and women have trained on its rolling sandy hills. Warfare has changed, but most of the land has remained almost unchanged during almost a century of use.
I spent time training at this sprawling base in the late 1960s in this very uniform, which is now a little snug.
What I did not know then was the long, rich social and natural history of this land, the untold story of Fort Bragg. The civilian most responsible for the hidden treasures of Fort Bragg is Jeff Irwin, Program Manager of the Cultural Resources Management Program at Fort Bragg.
I like to think of Fort Bragg as an island of conservation. There's a considerable amount of development occurring all around Fort Bragg and all around the country. But Fort Bragg is 160,000 acres of land in a very unique physiographic region that has been largely untouched by massive scale development. It's mostly forested landscape, and we understand the land use history now through our work from about 10,000 years ago up until today. Fortunately, because there hasn't been large-scale development, we have landscapes that reflect American Indian activity from millennia ago. We have landscapes that reflect early settlement, 19th century communities, Civil War battlefields, these sorts of things, and they're largely intact, visible, and objects that we can study archaeologically. You'd be hard-pressed, especially in the eastern U.S., to find this amount of territory that's relatively undisturbed and presents the opportunities that we have here. The Cultural Resources Program at Fort Bragg is here to make sure that everything that's historically significant on Fort Bragg is identified, protected, and to a certain extent understood. We identify anything that's over 50 years old and significant. That can include archaeological sites that date several millennia back, as well as historic buildings, cemeteries, and battlefields and landscape elements, these types of things. We not only identify and protect historic properties, but we try to interpret them and provide that information to the public so that they can appreciate what's unique about Sand Hills history.
As we observed and as we learned from Jeff, doing a cultural inventory on tens of thousands of acres can be hot, dirty work.
Identifying cultural resources is pretty labor-intensive work. We've been at it for years here, and we've reached the point where we have about 80% of the installation surveyed, 80% of 160,000 acres. We've recorded 4,500, roughly, archaeological sites. We have hundreds of historic buildings as well as a couple dozen cemeteries, the Civil War battlefield, and a few others. This can be pretty grueling work at times. We have folks out there in the field walking every acre of Fort Bragg, digging holes in the ground, screening the soil, pulling out artifacts when they're lucky, and finding nothing but sterile sand when they're not. Human history begins here in the Sand Hills about 12,000 years ago. The oldest artifacts we found on Fort Bragg date to that time frame, about the end of the last ice age. Since then, and beginning about 10,000 years ago, we find archaeologically a consistent human presence over thousands of years up until about 1500 AD, just before the Europeans begin to settle permanently in the southeast. The artifacts that we find are typically stone tools and ceramics, and they're common all over the landscape. They're somewhat ubiquitous. We joke sometimes that Fort Bragg is a single archaeological site.
During our visits to the base, Exploring North Carolina had the privilege of working with Dr. Linda Carnes McNaughton, Curator of Collections and Historical Archaeologist at Fort Bragg. No one knows more about European settlement of the region than Linda.
Fort Bragg began as Camp Bragg in 1918. Originally, the purchase was 130,000 acres that was purchased by the War Department, what the Department of Defense was called at that time. In 1997, it expanded an additional 30,000 acres to now encompass 160,000 acres of land. And the cultural resources contained within that landmass is what our office is responsible for. A lot of people ask us, why was Camp Bragg established in this area known as the Sandhills? Why here? And basically it had to do with the fact that there was a sparsely populated landscape. There were no large cities here. Most of the people who lived here lived in small communities or hamlet-size occupations. It had access to the railroad, which at the end of World War I is what the Army was very interested in, and that was the way they transported a lot of their goods around the country, is by railroad. It also had a large enough river system, the Lower Little River, good flowing streams, as well as the Cape Fear Valley. So all of those factors combined made it very appealing to the Army to send down their appraiser, Gilbert Woods. So his first task was to create a cadastral map, a property owner's map of who the current landowners were at that time. Secondly, he applied an appraisal value to those, whether they were farm fields or they were pine forests or they had access to river system or fresh water or railroad and the buildings on them. So then that data was compiled and given back to the War Department for them to then begin that process of making offers on the land.
In this lightly settled Sandhills region of North Carolina, there was a culturally diverse group of landowners.
So we asked the question, who were the people that Gilbert Woods talked to who made the offer for the purchase for the Army? Predominantly, about 75% of the people he approached were descendants of the Highland Scots. Folks who had immigrated here in the 1750s through the 1850s, originally coming from the islands of Jura, Skye or Isla, and the Argyll Peninsula near Campbellton. That was their major port of export, and they came to Wilmington, up the Cape Fear Valley, up the Cape Fear River, and settled into the Sandhills. Many of those descendants of those people are also buried in the 27 cemeteries that we have on Fort Bragg. The second, perhaps largest group were African Americans who would have come here originally as enslaved Africans. Many of these stayed, became tenant farmers, also became landowners, so the descendants of those communities are also here. And the third group would be historic American Indians, predominantly in the western part of what's now Fort Bragg. And we know that these three very different ethnic groups were all coming together, all changing their cultures and blending together to become essentially North Carolinians. The people here grew subsistence farming activities for the most part. The main cash crop that it did have was, of course, the turpentining forest. The Scots came with that knowledge of how to extract tar and pitch from the pine trees, and that was a major export to the British colonies throughout the 18th centuries and into the early 19th centuries. After about 1830, they learned to turn tar and pitch into a process through distillation to turpentine. And turpentine then became a major export, also used in paints and varnishes and some medicines. So that still goes on today.
In the old country, the Scots had been accomplished distillers of spirits, including Scotch whiskey. The same skills were used for distilling turpentine.
The other sister cottage industries related to the turpentining and naval stores industry was coopering. So you had sawmilling, that was taking the lumber, taking the trees down after they were tapped out and turning it into lumber, building churches with it, building homes, exporting the lumber. And you also had coopering. And we find that from the census records when we look at the occupations of these people who lived here, that some of them were coopers. In fact, we even see it reflected in the cemeteries, because those who couldn't afford stone markers would often mark their graves with a piece of a barrel stave. Other types of cottage crafts that, of course, the Scots brought with them was the ability to do dry-laid stone wall. We have a large dry-laid stone wall that surrounds our largest cemetery here at Fort Bragg, made out of local ferruginous sandstone. So the Scots knew how to use them. They knew how to dress the stone, they knew how to mine it, dress it, and use it in dry-laid stone wall. They also were very proficient at stone carving. So if you look at the existing cemeteries, the 27 cemeteries, as sort of a reflection again of some of those cottage industries, you may see these dry-laid stone walls. You may see hand-carved headstones made out of local material, as well as elaborately carved stones out of imported material.
The hardy Scots also brought with them two other important pieces of their culture: their religion, Presbyterianism, and their native tongue, Gaelic. The Longstreet Church, located on the old Yadkin Road, was one of the first Presbyterian churches in the South. The first church building was a log structure, completed in 1766. It is marked today by carved foundation stones. The present church building was completed in 1847 and is maintained by Fort Bragg.
Church services were done in Gaelic, church singing, the psalm singing was done in Gaelic. Primarily types of legal agreements were done in Gaelic. The communication between families was done in Gaelic. And those who owned slaves also learned to communicate with their owners and others in Gaelic, particularly if they attended church with them and learned to have church service in Gaelic.
Many of the 27 early cemeteries on the land occupied by Fort Bragg forever record the Scottish Highland names still found throughout North Carolina's sandhills.
So a lot of our research into these families of who lived here and whose ancestors are buried in the cemeteries, we make those connections very directly if you look at the names on the headstones. And then you perhaps go to the phone books in Rayford or Aberdeen and you open them up and you'll see some of the same names repeated. McPhails, McDermotts, Blues, Monroes, Pattersons, other people in this area, McLaughlin's, very popular names, even McDonald's.
There is another segment of Fort Bragg's history about which few people are aware, a history of sacrifice in wars fought long ago.
Just like today's population of Fort Bragg, many people who live here or live in the perimeter of this military base contribute a lot to war efforts. And that's always been the case for people who have lived in this area of the Sandhills, beginning with the earliest conflict of the colonies, the American Revolution. It was experienced here by the Scottish immigrants and others who lived here, regulators in fact. It's been experienced through the Civil War period of America. We had large numbers of population from the Sandhills area in these communities of Argyll and Inverness and Manchester going off to war and never coming back. We know that from family histories. We also know it from church records that the impact was very severe on the population of this area. There are gaps in the church records that for 16 years there were no christenings because there were no new babies.
Although soldiers went off to fight in faraway battles in the American Civil War, there was a major clash between Union and Confederate cavalry forces on 10 March 1865, right in the middle of today's Fort Bragg. It was the Battle of Monroes Crossroads. Today, relics of this battle are still being found. The artifacts of this battle from this war between brothers are preserved at Fort Bragg. After the Civil War, it would have been understandable if people had left this land of the longleaf pine. But they stayed.
But people stayed. People stayed on this landscape. It's always supported them. They maintained their turpentining, they maintained their Tar Heel heritage, and kept it going. I like to sum it up by thinking of this area of the Sandhills, the pre-Fort Bragg landscape, as the land of tartans and turpentine and turmoil.
Another war has been fought and won at Fort Bragg. Secretary Bill Ross of the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources told Exploring North Carolina a compelling story of environmental stewardship.
In the 1990s, the situation at Fort Bragg might be described as the Woodpecker Wars. At that point, concerns about the threatened and endangered species, the red-cockaded woodpecker, had interested parties at war. There was Fort Bragg, there was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, there were private environmental groups, there were state agencies, and it was a very polarized and contentious debate. A number of people described them, that situation, as the Woodpecker Wars. The great thing that happened was that the warring parties found a better way, and that better way has led to success for every interest that was involved, from the base to the woodpeckers to the communities around Fort Bragg. They came up with the idea of a partnership approach that might serve all their various interests and missions at the same time. The partnership came to be called the Sandhills Conservation Partnership, and it was a non-traditional blend of partners. There was Fort Bragg, there was a federal agency, Fish and Wildlife, a state agency, Parks and Recreation. There were private environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense, and there were private landowners involved as well. Recently, the Sandhills Conservation Partnership celebrated a great success. The head of the Fish and Wildlife Service came to town to announce that this particular threatened population of red-cockaded woodpeckers had indeed recovered, and at the same time the military base had been able to reduce the restrictions on training that before the partnership had gotten together were being imposed on the base because of the woodpeckers' threatened status. At the same time, the vitality of this economic driver for the Sandhills region was assured in an important way. The partnership successes that emerged out of the Woodpecker Wars led the leaders of the various organizations involved, garrison commanders, community leaders, agency leaders, and environmental group leaders, to think about what else might be done. A partnership emerged, for example, to achieve a sustainability in the region around Fort Bragg, the Sandhills, called Sustainable Sandhills. The woodpecker model, recovery model, was applied in the area around Camp Lejeune. The Sustainable Sandhills model is now being replicated on a multi-state regional basis in the southeastern United States.
Stewardship at Fort Bragg and cooperation with its neighbors has existed for many years. There is no better witness to Fort Bragg's willingness to work with the environmental community than Alvin Braswell, Curator of Herpetology at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences.
Large blocks of habitat are extremely important to our natural systems and protecting the diversity in North Carolina. Military bases are areas where we have some of our best large blocks of native habitats. Amongst these, Fort Bragg is premier in that the amount of acreage, the type of management they pursue in there. Their primary goal is national security, but they're also helping us greatly with protecting our national treasures. The museum's history with Fort Bragg dates back for many, many years, into the 1940s. Personally, my first involvement with Fort Bragg area was in the late 1960s. I was particularly interested in the reptile and amphibians that occur in this wonderful longleaf ecosystem that's being maintained there. In particular, the eastern tiger salamander, the Carolina gopher frog were of interest of mine, in addition to the northern pine snake and the southern hognose snake. All four of those species are ones that we're greatly concerned about in North Carolina because of their declines, and Fort Bragg is maintaining some wonderful habitat for them. Of course, there are lots of other species there too, and fascinating things like the eastern coach whip and the beautiful scarlet king snake.
Soldiers training at Fort Bragg are surrounded by amazing plants and animals. More than one soldier has been startled by giant fox squirrels in the oak and longleaf canopy, squirrels the size of small cats. Soldiers in wet areas can see the mysterious Venus flytrap and elegant pitcher plants.
Fort Bragg's work with the federally endangered red-cockaded woodpecker is notable, and they should be applauded for their efforts. They've done a wonderful job of managing for that species and promoting their recovery on base. They have a huge number of colonies and nesting pairs. This is a key species in the longleaf pine ecosystem, because if you manage and do a good job with red-cockaded woodpecker, you also are doing a wonderful job with a wide range of other species that are typical of the longleaf ecosystem, which used to be a huge system in southeastern United States. It's been greatly diminished. It is an endangered ecosystem itself. But Fort Bragg protects a huge area of longleaf and these other species in association with that.
Now you've seen the other Fort Bragg. The American military defends our way of life. But I hope you also appreciate the great job they do in preserving our cultural and natural resources.
As my good friend Bill Ross has said, the great stewardship successes at Fort Bragg have not been